Agony of watching their 6-year-old boy shot dead. Tonight, we are live inside Aleppo. Good evening from inside Aleppo, a place which more than any other has come to symbolise the horror, the fear, the sheer wanton destruction which has brought the world to its state today. Now, you hear more about the besieged east of this city, but tonight we are in the government-controlled west, and you will hear the sound of gunfire and artillery during this broadcast because this city is functioning, it has supplies, but violence is a daily agony for the people who live here, like the family I met today whose little boy was shot dead in front of them on Saturday. Their grief still utterly raw. Now, the shockwaves from this terrible conflict are being felt all around the world, from refugee crises to East-West relations. Just days before the US election, which could change so much, does anyone have the answers?
And I'm in Moscow, where it is, of course, the might of the Russian Air Force, which has largely turned around the fortunes of the Assad government in Syria in the war there. But here today, apparently the force of the same government turned on the Russian people, as the authorities here in Moscow, it seems, have shut down the entire operation of the international human rights organisation Amnesty International.
And from the epicenter of the political tension in the Western world, the brutal contest here between the bully and the criminal, the abusive names that Trump and Clinton have traded with each other, the fight too tight to call with 6 days to go. Tonight, from New Orleans, we focus on the racial condition of America as we report the low turnout amongst black voters in early voting.
America is now more united. We did it.
And a young woman whose joy at Obama's first presidential election was uncontrollable, but who 8 years on is distressed by the lack of impact Obama's presidency has had on prejudice in America.
To still know that to some people, I'm judged simply by the color of my skin. That's hard.
And here in the UK tonight, the Prime Minister admits there's more to do to tackle air pollution as judges accuse the government of woefully inadequate plans in a landmark court win for environmental campaigners. And burned and scarred during the Second World War, the airmen known as the Guinea Pig Club for the pioneering plastic surgery they received see their surgeon given a memorial.
So welcome to Aleppo, a city emblematic of these violent times, a place where homes are reduced to rubble and where even the ruins have become the spoils of war. Now, since 2012, Aleppo has been split along east-west lines. The Syrian government and its allies control the west of the city. Rebel factions control the east. Since airstrikes were put on hold last week, rebels have gained ground in the west. Battle lines have been redrawn as they seek to break through to join up with their colleagues in the east, with more attacks here in the government-held west. Now, if the world does stand at a crossroads, the war here in Syria stands right at the centre of it all. And as I've been finding out today, families are suffering the agony of death and violence never very far away. From first glimpse, Aleppo is a city on fire. As you get closer, you realise quite how shattered this place is. Pulverised as Syrian forces retook suburbs from the rebels. For 6 days now, those rebels have been fighting back as they try to break the siege of East Aleppo. As we entered the city, the Syrian army was firing on them. We counted 14 outgoing artillery strikes in half an hour as warplanes fired on rebel positions. There it is. That is East Aleppo, where the siege is taking place, and it stretches from the citadel up there all the way around to that green space that you can see, and that line of damaged buildings there is really the front line, and you can see little bits of smoke. That's a piece of outgoing artillery fire we just heard, but there are smoke fires dotted all around that area. It's not clear whether they've been started deliberately to try and obscure the view for any warplanes flying overhead, and we have seen some today, or whether some of them are also places that have been hit. But over there is where much of the fighting is taking place, because the rebels are trying to break in from territory they have on the outskirts of Aleppo to link up with eastern Aleppo, and so there's a lot of firing going on at that end of the city. On the government-controlled side, they know who their friends are. But even Vladimir Putin, whose bombers have transformed the war, is dwarfed in the cult of personality around President Assad. On the 6th floor of this West Aleppo block, full of displaced people from the east, Abdelmenem takes me to meet his wife Lama. On Saturday, she took their 6-year-old son Bara out to meet friends. She had no idea a sniper had them in his sights. This is the bullet hole.
هاي دخلت هون طلعت من هون.
Can you tell me what happened?
ما أشوف ولا فجأة ضربه وصار يصرخ. شلته لابني أنا حطيته في حضني وطلعنا بنفس السيارة إسعاف. عم بفكفك له إن اسبدرينه وعم بفكفك له إياه هيك إنه فكرت أجره. إيه وعم هو قال لي إنه لولو ما فيني شيء يعني لا تخافي علي ومات. يعني أخذ آخر نفس ومات.
Bara's father keeps a treasure trove of pictures on his phone, and the shocking video of his only child being buried 3 days ago in a cemetery that is now itself under rebel fire, so they can't visit.
الطفل ما ذنب الطفل إن كان بهذا الطرف أم هذاك الطرف، فهي بالنهاية جرحة قلب أم وكل عائلة لقلوبها. يعني نحن ما بنتمنى هذا الشيء ولكن رايدين هذا الشيء. يعني نحن حلب كانت هي مضيئة بالحياة، مضيئة بالنور.
There are up to 400,000 mothers like Lama, according to the latest UN review, and though it's contested by the Syrian government, they say the overwhelming majority are on the rebel side. So many mothers over there have also lost children. Do you feel like them now?
هلا أنا أي أم عندها شعوري أي أم بيروح ابنها بتنجرح، بس ما مجبورين إنه يبركوا هنن هنيك. يعني أنا اليوم ليش ما ضليت هنيك؟ أنا بطلع أنا مستعدة أبرك على التراب، ما بدي يعني مالي مستعدة إني أضل بين عالم أحرار وحوش.
For now, Lama has no choice but to live in this agony, looking out over the East Aleppo she used to call home, while the rebels and Syrian government fight for control. Both sides believing their survival depends on it. Well, the Russian intervention here in Syria has been utterly fundamental and has changed events on the ground quite dramatically. As we drove from Homs into Aleppo today, we saw Russian forces on the road coming this direction. But in Moscow, President Putin has moved against one of the organisations that's been very critical of his actions here in Syria, Amnesty International. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, is at their offices.
Yes, indeed, Krishna. Well, we can't say that the extraordinary events here today can be placed at the desk of President Putin, but we can, of course, say that the criticism that Russia is abusing human rights globally in terms of its war in Syria and domestically in Russia, that criticism seems to grow ever louder. And those critics will have another argument in their armoury after what happened today. For the staff arriving at the Amnesty International office, it was far from business as usual. At first glance, they thought it's a burglary. At second glance, they thought this is anything but. It says much that Amnesty asked us not to identify the building's location in which their office is housed, fearing reprisals. Left by the office front door, the old lock destroyed and lying on the floor, and nearby the empty box of a new motion sensor. All this the debris of some kind of break-in and a possible message from those who did it. Paperwork from the Moscow authorities which shuts down an entire human rights operation across Russia. Stuck across the door. The notice reads, "Do not attempt to enter this building under any circumstances. If you do, it's an offence." And at the bottom, there's a number you can ring. Amnesty said they tried, but nobody picked up.
We are used to the fact that nobody likes us, and this is, to me, it's an indication that we are going right direction. When everybody doesn't like you, it's okay. But this reaction sounds very strange because it doesn't look very professional from the point of view of the Moscow authorities.
The Kremlin spokesman said, "I know nothing about this. It's news to me." Amnesty now fear that the authorities could force them to re-register their operation here, then make that impossible for what they would call administrative reasons. And Amnesty say it's everything to do with human rights, nothing to do with administration. And they add, if that happens, it could threaten their entire operation here across Russia. Just to sum up, this could end Amnesty's work in Russia.
Well, it's one of the possibilities because it's not a secret that Russian authorities like to apply administrative measures, and if there is any criticism, they would say, well, look, this is administrative, it's nothing to do with human rights, we are not against it.
So, for now, Sergei Nikitin's camped out in a nearby cafe. His mobile, all he has. Computers, office, an entire operation in this country, off limits. Winter is early this year, but it's not alone in tightening its grip on the Russian people. At home, shutting down Amnesty may raise few eyebrows, but the image reflected from Russia abroad will suggest anything but peace and goodwill. Alex Thompson, Channel 4 News, Moscow.
Well, if this is a battle between East Aleppo over there and the West over here, there is also, of course, an East-West dimension on the global geopolitical scale, because the fault lines of the US election are also in many ways defined by what's happening here in Syria. Let's go to New Orleans now and Jon Snow.
Krishnan, thank you. Welcome back to Jackson Square, New Orleans, once a slave market serving the southern states. Once a fitting place to look at the still parlous state of race relations in this country, an issue Mr. Trump's candidacy has done nothing to improve. Though early voting shows a lack of enthusiasm amongst black voters, even when it comes to voting for Hillary. Tonight, we focus on how race is playing in this campaign. We meet aspiring young black students we first met 8 long years ago amid Obama's first ecstatic victory. They testify both to the value of his presidency, but also to the country's failure to match it with progress. And we report the vicious and abusive battle of words that has become the hallmark of this campaign, and how states once thought safe for Mrs. Clinton are swinging, and how some of Mr. Trump's own states are also in the balance. And later we'll hear from Kylie Morris in Phoenix, Arizona. But first, Matt Fry has the latest from the nation's capital of Washington. Matt.
Well, John, just a few minutes ago, I spoke with a former Secretary of Defense, a Republican, and he said that if Donald Trump were elected president of this country, it would be the most destabilizing event at the moment in the world. Now, imagine that coming from a Republican former Secretary of Defense. He also said that if Hillary Clinton won, but she didn't get a majority in the House or the Senate, especially the Senate, then we would have more dysfunctioning government here, more logjam, and that too would be destabilizing for not just for America, but for the rest of the world. So whatever happens, we're going to be in a bit of a pickle. So with that in mind, let's look at the latest polls. Now, as you mentioned earlier, John, yes, it is true that African Americans have been voting in large numbers early, but in much smaller numbers than they did in 2012 or 2008. Black turnout is down, and that is bad news for Hillary Clinton. At the same time, Donald Trump has had quite an extraordinary momentum given where he was a week ago in the polls. He was 6 to 8 points down. He is now level pegging with Hillary Clinton in at least 3 polls, and in 1 poll he's actually 1 point ahead and playing catch up in those crucial swing states, although not in all of them, and not nearly enough to be the probable winner. She has been sounding much more shrill than she wanted to, much more defensive. She was going to spend the week talking about policy and healing the nation. She's not been able to do that. But here's my final point. A little bit of panic goes a long way to get people out to the polls, and that is what she is now relying on. And the Clinton machine, the Democratic Party machine for that famous ground game, is incredibly meticulous and efficient and very good at actually getting people to the polls. So probability is still on her side. However, it's going to be a nail biter, and there are some very big issues at stake. Over to Kathy in London.
Thanks, Matt, and we'll have more from the team across America later in the programme. But now President Trump, if the polls carry on the way they are, it really could happen. But are current events around the world, from the US to Syria and even here in the UK, a sign of dangerous times? Or can we afford to be more optimistic? Joining me now is Abigail Austin, a former officer in the British Army. Abby has just returned from the States, where she made a film broadcast tonight on Channel 4 looking at the role of the transgender movement in this election season. I'm also joined by the Russian analyst Alexander Nekrasov, and from Washington, D.C. by Rahim Kassam from Breitbart News. He was running for the UKIP leadership, but withdrew earlier this week. Abby Austin first. Parts of Syria are lying in ruins. You've got President Trump, perhaps. You've got Russia resurgent. What do you make of it all?
I think we're at a bigger crossroads now than at any time since the end of the Vietnam War in the 1970s. What we've got now at the end of 2016 is a United States that's still recovering from the recession of 2008, two damaged political candidates fighting for presidential election, and a United States that's reeling from being punched in the face over losing every war it's entered into for the last 15 years. What's different now in this agenda is that we're looking at a situation where the world is no longer governed by two superpower blocs that has a shared philosophy of mutually assured nuclear destruction, and an information age which has unleashed the dogs of war, where sections of society that previously would not have had a voice are extending hateful, xenophobic and nationalistic language around the world. And that, frankly, has scared and upset this generation.
Well, Alexander Nekrasov, the dogs of war have been unleashed, says Abby Austin there. That suits Russia very well, doesn't it? Because Russia wants the West to be fearful, doesn't it?
Well, it doesn't fit Russia at all, because nobody wants a third world war, and especially a nuclear war. So Russia has similar interests like any other country. It wants stability around its borders. It wants stability in the Middle East because it influences Russia as well. So
if it wants stability, why is Russia egging on a Trump presidency? That would provide the very opposite of stability.
To be honest with you, if Russia really wanted to hurt America, it would be supporting Hillary Clinton, because Hillary Clinton is a very divisive candidate. I think that if she wins, there is a big chance that America will start to disintegrate.
Well, let me get Abby Austin to respond to that.
Well, if I can quote an American general friend of mine, he told me last month that Vladimir Putin is the man who wakes up in the morning deciding what mischief he can do around the world. He has a very narrow nationalistic agenda which is primarily focused on the maintenance of power and keeping himself in power. He knows that every Russian leader in recent history has fallen through weakness, and this is about the maintenance of his position within Russia. The tragedy is that it is affecting international politics and the discourse around the world that's leading to great uncertainty.
Quick response from you.
Well, I totally disagree with that, because the problem is that the current situation we have has been caused by the meddling of the West in Ukraine. And I actually try to explain it to people, that Russia is mostly upset with what is happening in Ukraine, because on its borders we have a civil war and nobody pays any attention. Everything is about Aleppo. People are dying in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. Its government is killing its own people. And nobody cares.
Instability in the West would allow Russia once again to make a move on Ukraine.
No, it's not Russia moving on Ukraine. Russia did not create that situation. If there wouldn't have been an armed coup in Kiev, there would not have been a referendum in the Crimea. There would not have been a civil war in the east.
Let me turn to Rahim Kassam now. And people said that Brexit wouldn't happen. People are saying that Donald Trump cannot win. Have the establishment got it wrong again, in your view?
Well, I think if you look at the polling that we're now seeing, they are slightly beginning to realise that this is much closer than they could have ever imagined. And that happened during Brexit, and it's happening now. But also we're looking at, especially today, the early voting statistics that are coming out from all across the United States, and it just looks like that Hillary Clinton isn't able to cobble together the same coalition as Barack Obama did. I think when you talk about the Russian angle specifically, I think there is a case to be made that Russia would easily lose a war with the United States and with NATO and the West, and so its only objective, I think, in this is for an era of stability. Now, if you can look at the context of how Russia is involving itself or not involving itself in the United States election, election, you have to go back to Hillary Clinton and her foundation. This is the same foundation that took tens of millions of pounds from Ukrainian and Russian oligarchs, and uranium creation in the United States is now massively owned by the Russians because of Secretary Clinton.
But
Remember, Secretary Clinton and the Democrats...
How can people support a man who lies routinely and repeatedly? I mean, one fact checker recently out in Washington said that President Trump lied 37 times a day.
Well, I know, I saw that statistic, and it's an incredibly spurious one. It goes down to such minutiae as, you know, picking at words where he says things like which instead of that. There is, I think, fault on both sides of this divide. I'm not sure that anybody believed that this was the ideal fight that they wanted for the next US president. But I think when you look
let me just get a final
Mr.
response.
Trump versus
Okay,
Mrs. Clinton,
hang on a sec, because we're nearly out of time. I'm sorry to interrupt. Abby Austin, post-truth politics, does that give you something to fear, or actually is it time for a political reboot? Politics is broken.
I think we're seeing a political reboot across the world. We saw it in the Brexit vote, we're about to see it in the American election. But I have faith in America as a force for good. It has always done the right thing. The trouble is, as Winston Churchill says, it exhausts every other option first.
Abby Austin, Alexander Nekrasov and Rahim Kassam in Washington, thank you very much for joining us. Now, environmental campaigners have won a High Court battle, forcing the government to improve its plans to tackle air pollution, as judges agreed the current scheme was woefully inadequate. Client Earth, which brought the action, is demanding a network of clean air zones in cities across the UK by 2018 to make sure legal pollution limits are enforced. The Prime Minister has already hinted of changes to come, telling MPs there was more to do. Fatima Manji reports.
The thing about air pollution is that you can't often see it or smell it, but it is there and it's an invisible killer.
This is one of the UK's most polluted roads. The monitoring device shows almost everyone walking down it is inhaling illegal levels of toxic air. But it's not an isolated problem.
So we can see the spike's going up to 40, so it was about 20 before.
Nationally, up to 50,000 people a year are dying early because of poor air quality. And today the High Court declared government plans for tackling it woefully inadequate.
It really shouldn't take campaigners taking the government to court to say that it needs to take urgent action on this. It's a public health crisis. It's time that we started treating it as one.
The court case revealed documents showing the Treasury blocked plans for a charge on diesel cars because angering motorists would be politically very difficult. At this primary school, one of the most polluted in the country, that makes some parents very angry.
Our youngest has been in hospital twice with wheezes, and you can't guarantee that's connected to that, but it makes you more concerned about it, obviously.
As a mother and as part of this community where we live around here, it's very bad, it's very horrible.
We live in London. It is one of the busiest roads. I drive. A lot of the times I drive to school, so I probably add to the pollution. And if you don't like it, you need to move further out, really.
The London boroughs of Westminster and Kensington and Chelsea are worst affected. But 3/4 of main roads across the capital have illegal levels of air pollution, and it's thought to cost nearly 10,000 lives a year. England has the dirtiest air in the UK. Perhaps unsurprisingly, large urban areas such as Birmingham and Bristol are particularly poor. But even smaller cities like Newport, Southampton and Lincoln are also heavily polluted. Campaigners say a national network of clean air zones is needed urgently.
What it will mean is moving away from diesel vehicles, which are the really dirty vehicles. This is a fantastic opportunity to move to electric vehicles. After Brexit, we keep hearing we want to lead the world. This is an opportunity to lead the world. But now it moves to the desk of the Prime Minister.
A spokesperson for Theresa May said that she accepts the court judgment, is determined to act, and will set out steps in due course. And yet there's an added complication in this quest for cleaner air. The government's backing a third runway at Heathrow, which will inevitably mean additional emissions.
So what does the judgment mean for the government's decision to expand London's Heathrow Airport? Well, it's triggered more concern about air pollution levels in already congested areas and the government's commitment to tackling it. Our science editor, Tom Clark, is at Heathrow. Tom.
Well, Kathy, this judgment could be a massive problem for the government's plans for expansion of Heathrow Airport. Now, it's not the runways just over there behind me that are the real issue here. It's all of the congested traffic coming to, from and around Heathrow Airport. Down there, you've got the Heathrow Link Road, regularly congested. Behind me on this side, you've got the A4, major trunk road bringing traffic to it, not far away the M4. This is a hot spot for nitrogen dioxide pollution, some of the worst in Europe. It's regularly in breach of legal limits. Today's ruling orders the government not just to meet those legal limits, but to do it a lot quicker than they planned. Currently, they said 2025. They've now got to do it a lot sooner. How do they do that and expand Heathrow, which is only going to bring more cars, trucks, lorries, buses to this site? But it goes far beyond Heathrow as well. The court has also found during the hearing that the modelling the government uses is far too optimistic for the levels of pollution we're expected to see. And that factoring in, of course, the fact that cars, many diesel cars, actually emit far more pollution than we thought. So the plans for just 6 clean air zones in towns and cities may have to be rolled out far wider, maybe up to 25 or 30 cities. The government really has a lot of work on its hands to meet those obligations now.
Tom in Heathrow, thank you very much for joining us. Now let's return to our top story and the American election, to John in New Orleans. John.
Welcome back to Jackson Square here in New Orleans. Now, when the United States elected its first African-American president, there was much hope that the country would begin a new chapter in race relations. This year's election campaign has very much moved away from that ideal. Just last night, a church in Mississippi was burnt down and the words "Vote Trump" were scrawled on the walls left behind. On the night of Barack Obama's historic victory in 2008, I met 2 young black students who believed that his presidency would lead to a more united country. 8 years on, we tracked them down to find out whether the change they'd hoped for had really come to America.
At this defining moment, change has come to America.
It was 8 years ago when America elected its first African-American president. Earlier that night, I was in Washington, D.C. at Howard, a historically black university. In the moment Obama was declared the winner, the room erupted. In the melee that followed, I spoke to 2 young women who until then had never dared to dream this moment would ever come. Did you not think it could happen?
I never thought in my lifetime that it would happen. But it happened tonight. It's a reality and we did it. America is now more united. We did it.
Because I can't believe that I got the opportunity to live to see something so great. Like, I can't describe it. I can't believe I got the chance to vote for the first black president.
They were just 2 young, joyous faces in the crowd. We didn't even know their names. All these years on, what had they made of Obama's presidency and their dreams of what it would bring? Finding one of them took us to the city of New Orleans, the Big Easy. The racial scar on President Bush's reign, the city has never fully recovered from Hurricane Katrina. This is where we found Sandy Booker, in her hometown. Now 26, she's doing an MBA at MIT and hoping to launch her own business.
How are you?
Lovely to see you.
It's so good to see you.
Really nice to see you. She is a living testament to what happened here. The largely black community flooded out of the city by Katrina, many of them never to return. She herself says she is still not ready to go back to the devastated district where she lived.
We're already talking about it long before the maths.
I was curious to see how she feels now about the night Obama won.
Oh. I'm on a chair, I think.
Their parents were at school when Martin Luther King was slain. Their grandparents were the children of slaves. For them, America has crossed a rampart from which no retreat is possible.
It's a reality and we did it. America is now.
Oh my God.
There you are. There you are.
Wow.
Oh, look at you.
Yeah.
Are you as hopeful today as you were 8 years ago?
No, in no way. In no certain way. There's still a lot of us who are suffering and who have not experienced the hope that was promised, I think, in that video, to be quite honest.
What should he have achieved that he didn't?
I think that he had a big impact for a lot of communities except his own. I wish that my black president would have spoken more to black people. When it comes to whether it's the justice system, equal access to health care, job opportunities, the suffering that we've had at the hands of police, he quite honestly failed us and disappointed a lot of black people.
As a highly educated black woman, do you experience prejudice?
So I've dealt with it in different ways. I was in a car with my girlfriend. We were stopped by a cop, and he never told us the reason for stopping us. But I just remember the fear that grasped me. I couldn't even look him in the face because in that moment I was scared for my life. I can't take out a graduate degree from MIT and say, look, this is who I am. That doesn't matter in that moment, because in that moment, my skin is seen as a threat. Imagine how that feels, for the color of your skin to be seen as a threat to a police officer who has the power to let you walk away with your life or not. Doesn't matter what heights you ascend to in this country. Doesn't matter, you know, so. And that's what's upsetting. To come from this great place, I came from poverty, and to ascend to the heights that I have with an education, but to still know that to some people, I'm judged simply by the color of my skin. That's hard. Yeah.
8 years ago, she said America was more united than ever. Her feelings now couldn't be more different.
The time was now, and I don't know that he sees that time and that moment in the way that he could have. And so it's kind of like, you know, I look back and it's, well, what happened? What happened to the promise?
We found our other face in the crowd much further north, in Obama's hometown, Chicago. When Obama was elected, Kehlani Cook was 19, studying medicine. She's now 27, a software engineer. I caught up with her at her mum's house in the Chicago suburbs.
I don't know what's making me emotional.
Do you still feel like that?
100%. 100%.
He's not disappointed you?
I think that in a lot of ways, President Obama's hands were tied in a lot of different ways. And so for that reason, do I agree with every little thing he did? Not necessarily, but to see like everyone come together and like vote for someone who even 50 years ago, no one would have ever even looked his direction, you know? And so I think his presidency means so much.
Hope was his campaign. Are there things that you hoped for then that he hasn't delivered?
I think everyone put so much pressure on one man. He couldn't be black people's president. He had to be everyone's president. And I think a lot of people lost sight of that. They kind of looked at him as a savior instead of someone who just wanted to create a little change each day at a time.
So what has having a black president done to race?
I think it shed a light on the people who weren't ready for that to happen. And his election opened up Pandora's box of these sub-communities who just absolutely weren't for it. Trump would not be where he is had Obama not been president, period. Because Trump is catering to those people who that night of the election that you watched me scream and yell and cry, those people who were doing the same thing but for a different reason. They were screaming, yelling, and crying because they could not, at the end of the day, have a black man in the White House.
I wonder how history will judge him.
I hope history is fair to him.
It was here in Chicago's Grant Park where Obama gave his historic acceptance speech.
But tonight, because of what we did
During his time in office, he was stymied by a Republican-held Congress. his presidency was also overshadowed by the worst racial tension in America since the civil rights movement in the 60s.
Oh, this is it. This is it. Grant Park, where Obama gave his speech. This is so cool. He would say, it's not about the red states. It's not about the blue states.
We have never been just a collection of individuals or a collection of red states and blue states.
It's about the United States of America.
We are and always will be the United States of America.
I must say you're pretty good. I'm passing it to you. I'm passing it to you, America. Thank you for these 8 years. Obama out. And he moonwalks off the stage. Oh, Obama, Obama. Hallelujah, Lord is just.
Could he have done more? Should he have done more? The symbolism, the expectation were so high. Perhaps the legacy of that joyous night 8 years ago is one of both pride and disappointment. With me now, Brian Trasher, who was a leading member of the Donald Trump campaign here in Louisiana, and I'm also joined by Dr. Calvin Mackay, a lifelong resident of New Orleans, who led efforts to rebuild the city after Hurricane Katrina. He featured prominently in Spike Lee's documentary about the disaster. He also works closely with the African-American community. Calvin, what's your response to what that film was all about, which is really the question of how African Americans have fared in the last 8 years?
Well, the Spike Lee documentary really gave African Americans the opportunity to speak their voice about the tragedy that happened. The last 8 years have been the best of times and the worst of times. We thought things would be much better, but it seemed like a lot of the planning and work have been done on us instead of with us. So many African Americans feel that the city had been rebuilt to serve others than serve the citizens who make the city what it is.
You do feel, Brian, that this campaign is a pretty big contrast to Obama's campaigns of the past.
Yeah, I mean, you know, President Obama was a masterful campaigner. I think that he probably could have done better in the execution on following through of his promises and hope and change. We now, 8 years later, find a nation even more divided with even probably more racial tension.
Very
than when he took
frustrated
over.
by a Republican Congress.
Yeah, but the first 2 years of his presidency, he had an unabashed Congress that would do whatever he wanted, and then he had a Senate that would do whatever he wanted for his first 6 years. So it wasn't completely an obstructionist Republican Congress, as some would say.
And now in New Orleans, I mean, a lot of the African Americans have bled away. I mean, they were flooded out and they never came back.
Well, one story that was never told was that if I was, let's say, a middle-class African American with a degree, if I was a dentist, if I was a doctor, if I was an accountant, and I was serving the African American community, and you wake up one morning and your entire community is gone, what do you do? The story that hasn't been told is that many of the middle-class black African Americans left and established their lives in other places.
And what do you make now of this election?
Napoleon said a lead is a deal in hope. And somehow we have someone running for office who otherwise is appealing to the worst of what we are and what we can be. And that is very distressing in 2016.
This has been a troubling campaign. I mean, the abuse between the two candidates, both of them are guilty of abusing each other. But one also senses there have been terrible racial tensions raised by Mr. Trump's campaign.
I think that he's been given that moniker by the media, but I've yet to meet anybody who can point to a single example where he's said anything that was racially insensitive. And when he talks about immigration, he's talking about pro-legal immigration against illegal
immigration.
Ghettos
from hell, he's talked about. Ghettos from hell, he's talked about.
Well, he's
building walls
talking about
against
the failing
Mexicans.
infrastructure,
He's talked about banning Muslims. You know, I mean, you know, you go for it. It's all there.
Well, you know, when we're talking about bringing in Muslims without doing any kind of background checks, when they have declared war on us and they plan to attack us in our own communities, like we've seen on military bases and shopping malls, movie theaters, they've done it. So I think he's right to want to screen them.
Donald Trump has talked about his African Americans. He's talked about African Americans walking down the street and getting shot. I mean, he's appealing to. Donald Trump appeals to the worst in everyone. And the demographics that he's appealing to, he's not holding them responsible for the situation that they're in, so he's trying to give them a way out for the situation that they're in by blaming others.
But in fairness, Mrs. Clinton hasn't either really galvanized the African-American community with any much hope.
No, but she's not that type of candidate. She isn't galvanizing on any given day. On her best day, she's not the type of motivational type person. But what she has not done is attack people and attack people, their lifestyles, attack people where they live. She's not talked about locking people out. She's not,
Well, I mean, people are very frightened about what might happen after this election, even if Mr. Trump loses or wins.
Yeah, I mean, if he loses, then you're going to have a sitting president, presumably a President Clinton, who's going to be under federal investigation and more than likely indicted. If there's a Mr. Trump or President Trump, then you will definitely see an indicted and prosecuted Hillary Clinton for the crime she's committed that we're now seeing evidence of with these WikiLeaks
It's more
dumps.
the question of what Mr. Trump will do to the community.
Isn't it funny we now live in a country where people don't get what they weigh, then it's wrong? I thought we were a community of laws and law and order. This woman has been investigated for 30 years and never found guilty of anything, but yet and still we have politicians and lawyers say you are guilty, and if I'm elected, like with some third world country with a dictator, I'm gonna make sure that you go to jail. That is absolutely frightening.
Sadly, we're not going to find agreement between the two of us. We must wait 6 days and see what happens. Thank you very much indeed.
John.
And this is a contest where every single vote counts. Hillary Clinton is rallying supporters tonight in Arizona, a traditionally Republican state. Kylie Morris is there. Kylie.
Well, John, just as President Obama relied on inspiring African-American voters, Hillary Clinton is reaching out to her own coalition of support. She is here to persuade Hispanic voters to give her their support. But also she's running lots of ads reminding women how important it is that they should vote for her. She's reminding them of Donald Trump's misogynistic attitudes and hoping that will succeed. Some voters seem persuaded of this new ambition to put a woman in the White House, but for other voters, that is a lifelong ambition.
When you're ready, tell me.
Oh, in your own time.
Okay. God bless America.
Jerry Emmett is a woman of habit. She votes Democrat, drinks 2 beers a day, and sings a love song to her nation every morning.
From the mountain to the prairie.
In her home in the Arizona hills, she's counting the days to when she might celebrate another milestone in her 102 years. Yesterday, she went into town and cast a vote for Hillary Clinton.
How did that feel to be able to cast a vote for a woman president?
It was a once-in-a-lifetime shot, and maybe that's why God's let me live this long. He wanted me to have one last thrill. I saw my mother get to vote when women could vote for the first time. Go into a booth all by themselves and vote for whoever they wanted to vote for.
The line that the Japanese bombs did their work well.
Jerry's seen some history. She was 27 when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor.
Now the climax of the Southern.
39 when Elizabeth assumed the throne. 94 when the first African-American president moved into the White House.
And 51 votes for the next president.
Finally, in July, after a lifetime waiting, she called her state for Mrs. Clinton at the Democratic Convention.
Tell me what you think of Donald Trump.
I think he's a sad thing for our country. I don't know what's happened to America that anyone could back him. He said, I love war. What's he talking about? I lived through 2 wars.
Sit a moment with Jerry, and history seems to tilt in Hillary Clinton's favour.
Trump just speaks to people.
Faith Graham is only 13. This is her first television interview.
Now raise your hand in the air.
But she's no stranger to a big crowd.
Vote for Trump. Vote for Trump.
In the local campaign office, her dad is Arizona's Republican chairman, they want to make history by putting a renegade Republican in the White House, not a woman.
Did you vote Republican? Thank you so much. Make America great.
It would be fantastic to have a woman leading our country. I just don't think Hillary Clinton is the right one. Just something about her. It it just seems off. Just something, I just don't trust her at all.
You have this amazing letter here, Jerry,
Yes.
that arrived yesterday. I am humbled, as ever, by your support. With warm regards, she writes. Sincerely yours, Hillary Rodham Clinton. It's quite the letter.
I cried because she compared me to her mother.
If he wins and Hillary Clinton doesn't become the first woman president, what will that mean for you?
I'm 102. I don't think it'll make much difference in my lifetime. Whatever it is, I will try to make it right, and I will try to correct the error we've made, and that is an error.
The fight will go on.
Oh, yes. We've done this before.
After the break, a memorial is unveiled in Staffordshire to the World War II servicemen among the first to receive pioneering plastic surgery. And more from here in the cultural melting pot of New Orleans, election politics in the home of jazz.
Welcome back. Now, they call themselves the Guinea Pig Club after the experimental treatment they received. Airmen left badly burned and scarred during the Second World War were among the first to receive pioneering plastic surgery back in the early 1940s, developed by the surgeon Sir Archibald Mackindo. He gave the men back their lives, and today in Staffordshire, some of them watched the Duke of Edinburgh unveil a memorial honouring his work and those who served. And just to warn you, some of you may find some images in Andy Davies' report distressing.
For a club whose anthem includes the line, "We'd rather drink than fight," the Guinea Pigs have always been a rather special breed of veteran. Their ethos summed up by one today in these 3 words.
Aeroplanes, flames and Mackindo.
Sir Archibald Mackindo, the surgeon whose pioneering techniques in plastic surgery would prove so pivotal in the lives of his so-called guinea pigs, the World War II pilots and aircrew brought to him disfigured by war. Sandy Saunders was one after his Tiger Moth crashed and left him engulfed in flames.
I first saw Archibald Mackindo at the end of 1947, and he suggested that I needed 4 new eyelids. I'd already had all 4 grafted, so I needed 4 new eyelids, making my total count of eyelids 12 altogether.
There were the tubular skin grafts Mackindo helped develop and the camaraderie he helped foster, out of which the Guinea Pig Club was formed 75 years ago. Des O'Connell, terribly burned when his bomber crashed, is at 96 the last surviving founder member.
He gave us all that spirit to build a club. He made us all want to be together. He gave us this spirit of being friendly.
The affection with which the guinea pigs still hold one another is all too clear. 650 strong in their heyday, just 17 left now, 8 of whom gathered at the National Memorial Arboretum today to see Prince Philip unveil a monument to the club.
What's it like when you all get back together again like this?
Oh, it's very hearty. We are thrilled to see each other. It's a kinship that's very strange to understand and describe, but it is there. It's an affection. These poor old blighters might not be seen in general society as strong men, but they are. They've got an inner strength. Yeah.
There is much to celebrate in this monument to the Guinea Pig Club: courage, invention, and perhaps above all else, friendship.
And that was Andy Davies reporting on the memorial to a pioneering surgeon. Tonight's main news from America. The race for the White House is tightening with just 6 days to go, while Donald Trump has rejected an endorsement by the white supremacist Ku Klux Klan, calling their views repulsive. And right now in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, showing that he can still command a vast crowd and move them, President Obama has hit the campaign trail in support of Hillary Clinton. from Krishnan in Aleppo, from Kathy in London, from all of us here in New Orleans. Let's let that jazz swing in this city of street jazz. That's Channel 4 News. Have a great evening.